Hello and welcome to CASI's Spring Seminar Series. I'm Naveen. I'm a postdoctoral researcher at CASI and along with my colleagues moderate this series. Today's talk is in partnership with South Asia Center. Before I introduce today's speaker, just to put a plug for our last seminar for the spring semester on April 14th, same time by Dr. Swagato Ganguly of Times of India, who is also currently a visiting CASI fellow. We'll talk about Indian foreign policy and current state of play in Indo-Pacific geopolitics. Please register for this event on CASI's website. Today, I am delighted to welcome Professor Kanika Mahajan, Assistant Professor of Economics at Ashoka University. Her primary research interests include empirical development economics in the field of gender, labor, and agriculture. As part of her research agenda on gender and labor, she is currently working on issues around stagnation of women's labor force participation in urban India and decline in female employment in rural areas. Her other projects in the area of gender examine links between economic shocks and women's employment, gender and sanitation, and violence against women. In context of COVID-19, her research examines resilience of supply chains in agriculture and manufacturing sectors in India. In today's seminar, Kanika examines employer preferences for hiring men versus women using newly collected data on approximately 160,000 job ads posted on an online job portal in India. She applies machine learning algorithms on text contained in job ads to construct measures that indicate whether the job ad text is predictive of an employer's explicit gender preference. Also find gender earning gaps and hiring preferences. Her findings highlight how non-wage elements in job texts are associated with such behavior in the labor market. Kanika will present for 30 minutes and we will have questions from the audience for around 30 minutes. And if you have any clarificatory questions you want to ask her, please enter it in the chat box directly to me. And please keep your questions brief and to the point so we can get to as many as possible, and apologies in advance if I can't get to everyone. So if you have questions at the end, again, please enter directly to me in the chat box, Naveen Bharati. My name is, so enter it to my box. Finally, please be mindful about muting your mics throughout the duration of the event. Once again, thank you for interest and for being here today. With that, I'm going to hand over the platform to Kanika. Thank you.
Thank you, Naveen, and thank you, Cassie, for having me over. Just sharing my screen. Okay, I hope everyone can see my screen. So I'm very glad to be presenting again at CASI, though virtually this time, and hopefully will be at CASI soon, in person. So the paper and the work that I'm presenting today is co-authored with Suga Chaturvedi at ISI Delhi and with Zara Siddiq at the University of Bristol. And this paper is motivated by this extant literature in economics, which has looked at gender disparities in employment and wages. Since we're looking in the context of India at these gender gaps, specifically to mention, India has probably one of the largest employment gaps in gender across the world. Only about 22% of urban women participate in the labor market, whereas about 90% of urban men are employed in the working age group. The wage disparity is also quite large. On an average, an urban Indian woman who's employed would earn about 65 to 70% of the wages that of the employed man. And a large part of this gender wage gap has been shown to be explained by occupational segregation, not only in India, but across the world. Occupational segregation has received, a lot of attention in the literature on gender gaps. However, of late and more recent literature has started looking at within occupation disparity. So what the literature finds is that the occupational gaps have been closing down. However, the wage gaps have not been closing at the rate at which the occupational disparities have been closing. And hence this literature focuses on looking at within occupation attributes which can explain some of the disparities that we observe in the labor market across the gender. And here in this paper, what we want to focus on is the application stage. So the first stage in the labor market, when the candidates may be choosing a particular job to apply to, and what is the role that the attributes which are shown in the job ads can play in the process. How these attributes can affect posted wage, and how they actually direct the job search behavior of men and women differently in the labor market, and hence affect the final outcomes that we see in terms of the gender wage gaps, even at the application stage. So essentially, that's the main objective of this paper. So what we do in this paper to achieve our objective is we exploit this occurrence, which is peculiar to, probably the developing countries. It's something that you won't see in the developed country labor markets, is that the job ads in India allow employers to state an explicit gender preference. So some of the government job portals actually have a field which the employers can fill in, where they can mention whether they want a man or a woman for a job, whereas private portals, although they don't allow you to directly put in the field, but employers have found their way. So for example, here on the left-hand side, you see a job ad, where in the job description, the employer has written that the job, that the applying candidate should be a female only. Whereas the right-hand side job, you can see that the job title contains male. So clearly the employer is referring to being proactively looking for a male to hire in this particular job. This is the aspect of the Indian labor market that we actually exploit in this portal, in this paper. So we first examine these explicit gender preferences of employers on an online job portal. We then use the expression of the explicit preferences to actually, get how predictive, any job ad may be of a gender preference given the text that is coming in these job ads. And using that, we basically arrive at measures of implicit maleness or femaleness that could be associated with job ads. We then uncover, what are the attributes, which are going behind the measure of implicit maleness or femaleness that we are finding. And we systematically uncover these attributes by looking at 4 main categories which are important in the labor market, which are hard skills, soft skills, personality, and job flexibility. And we then see how these attributes are related to posted wages and the search behavior of male and female candidates on the platform, and how they may eventually lead to the gender wage gaps arising at the application stage. So broad findings, we find that on this portal, about 7.5% of job ads exhibit an explicit gender preference, of which slightly more than half are for women and about 10.5% are for men. And job ads which have an explicit female preference actually have the lowest advertised wage or posted wage on the portal. Now, jobs may not have an explicit preference, but they may contain words or text which is like a job ad which is being posted, which explicitly requests for a male or a female. And there we find that if the text of a job ad is predictive, that of some kind of a female preference, or at least what we see as female preference using the explicit job ads, then it has a significantly lower posted wage, and it also receives an increased share of female applicants. Lastly, when we undertake that category-wise analysis, we find that the 2 most important categories which seem to be directing the behavior of candidates are skills and job flexibility. So as I'll sort of detail out later in terms of how exactly we pin down on skills and flexibility as being the 2 critical factors in explaining the behavior. In terms of the literature that we contribute to, so there is literature which has looked at employer gender preferences in job ads using data on China and Indonesia. And the primary aim of the literature has been to see what kind of job ads have a gender preference, largely eliciting a negative skill targeting relationship, where job ads which have such gender preferences tend to be low skilled types. And the second behavior this literature has uncovered is that what happens if you take away a gender request from a job ad. So using an exogenous experiment in China, Kun and Shen actually show that if you take away presence of a gender request suddenly from a job portal, there is a diversification in the way candidates apply to different jobs. So in this paper, we build on this literature, we actually extend it to actually show what is really going behind these preferences? Why are employers even posting these preferences? And what are the kind of attributes of jobs which may be correlated with even existence of these preferences in the labor market to begin with? The second literature that we are related to is the literature that looks at job ad text in general and how it can lead to not just gender disparities, but in general labor market outcomes. So for instance, if you change the occupation to a male type, then do you see that the female responses fall in response to just changing the occupational nature of a particular job? The third literature that we contribute to is the one that looks at within occupation job attributes which may matter. And this literature has largely looked at commutation times as well as part-time versus full-time flexibility that may be valued more by females vis-a-vis men in the labor market. So let me jump into the data that we are using in this study for the purposes that I've already highlighted. So we use data on about 1.6 lakh job ads from an Indian online job portal that matches young urban job seekers. On an average, these are mid to high skill job seekers. So that's the labor market that this job portal is capturing. We use the job ads which have been posted between July 2018 and February 2020. An interesting feature of this data set is that about 87% of the job ads posted on this portal have an advertised wage. Now, usually papers that use wages from online portals or from job ads at least don't have that much wage data. So it's interesting that we're able to do much more with this wage data as compared to the existing literature. And we look at about 1 million job seekers, and during this time period, they have made about 6.45 million applications. So some of the key variables that we construct in our analysis, one is the explicit gender preference. Now, as I mentioned, this portal doesn't have, it's a private portal. It doesn't have any field per se. So we do a textual search where we search for terms which can stand for explicit female preference, like female, females, women, if all these terms are coming either in the title or the job description, and we call these ads as F jobs. We then search for words that may indicate an explicit male preference, and we call these as N jobs. Some ads may contain neither of the words, or they may contain both of them. These ads are referred to as N jobs in our analysis. And we also, get these ads double checked. So apart from doing a textual search, we also hired 2 independent annotators who actually went through these job ads and then confirmed that indeed the job ads that we've marked as F and M and N jobs do indicate the same as what we've marked them. So in total, what we find eventually is that about 7.5% of job ads indicate a gender preference, with slightly less than half, slightly more than half for women, and slightly less for men. The other important variables are the education and the experience requirements in the job ad, and I'll detail the variables later in terms of how we include them in our analysis. The third most important variable is the occupational classification, because we are interested in controlling and looking at within occupation variation. So here, the job portal doesn't give us any occupation classification for a job ad. So what we do is that we use the job titles, which have been shown to be more informative about occupations, at least in the US job market. And here, either one can use a manual classification using, if similar words are coming in 2 job titles, they can be clubbed together, or one can actually put together or cluster together job titles, which not only have the same words, but which may have semantically similar words. For instance, like a translator or a transcriber, which is like a similar word. So if there are 2 job ads, one for a transcriber and the other for a translator, they would be actually put together by this clustering algorithm. So we use this clustering algorithm, but we also check our results to the robustness of the existing manual classification that the literature has used. In terms of how the broad data looks like, on a job ad front, about 50% of the jobs require at least college education, whereas in terms of experience, 67% require less than 1 year of experience. So they're mostly for freshers, and the average wage offered on the portal is around 230,000 rupees per annum. So these are the education and the experience requirements categories that we have constructed using the detailed categorization that the portal had. And these are the ones that we will be controlling in our analysis as we go further in the regressions. In the applicant data set, the average job seeker age is around 24 years on this portal. About 80%, 86% in fact have a university degree, and about 35% of the job seekers on the portal are women. The posted wages on this portal are slightly higher than the average urban worker would get. As I said, it is catering to the mid to high skill level workers. It's representative of that particular market, not of the lower wage segment or the lower skill segment, really. Now coming to our next important variable in terms of defining the implicit femaleness and maleness, which I spoke about a few minutes ago. So implicit femaleness is defined as the probability of placing an explicit female request conditional on the job text which appears in the job title and in the job description. And we similarly define maleness, which is the probability of having an explicit male request. To derive these probabilities, we basically use a multinomial logistic regression. We train it, and then we predict the maleness and femaleness for our sample, for the remaining sample for which there is no explicit request available. And even for the explicit ones, one can actually predict using the machine learning algorithm. So just to give you a broad idea on what we are finding. Now, typical occupations like beautician, personal secretaries, school teachers are very high on femaleness, whereas occupations such as cargo loader or delivery executive are very high on maleness. But not only is there occupational differentiation, even within an occupation, we see a lot of variation in the maleness and femaleness attributes. And why are these coming in? So let me just give you an example here. So let's take the example for business development manager. Okay, there are these two job ads. Now, both the job ads have the same title. However, the first job ad that you see here, the words in blue show that these words are contributing to maleness, and the words in red show that these words are contributing to femaleness. And on an average, what we find is that this job exhibits a female preference. Whereas the second job for a business development manager, on an average, there are more words which are contributing towards maleness. And with the same job title, given the words which are coming into these jobs, they are reflective of a preference for a male. And in fact, these are the actual job ads that we've taken. Of course, we've taken out the stop words, etc. So what you see are just the nouns, etc., which are used for training of the model. But what one can see is that it is not just about the occupation or what is the title of the job. It also depends on what the content of the job is, what that job really wants from the person which is to be hired. That would determine whether it has a male or a female preference. So the first thing we do is that we test some of the hypotheses in the existing literature, which have already been looked at using data sets from China and Indonesia. One is the negative skill targeting relationship, where we find that the gender preference is more likely to be in ads which have low education, low experience. Additionally, since we have wage data, we also find that these jobs have lower wages. At the same time, when we look at male preference, where the dependent variable takes a value 1 if it's a male, 0 if no, and -1 if there's a female preference, we find that if you have a male preference, explicit preference, these jobs have a higher wage as compared to the other jobs in the sample. The next thing we check is what happens to the total applications and the share of female applicants to a job ad when there are changes in explicit gender requests. And here again, what we find is that if there is an explicit female preference, the share of female applications is more. Well, if there is male preference, the share of female applicants is lower. So these sort of test some of the basic hypotheses that we would have about how people would behave on the portal. So next, what we do is that we exploit the maleness and the femaleness measures that we've constructed in our data set. And we want to see how the wages differ by femaleness and maleness. So here our dependent variable is log of wage in job ad I, which is for an occupation J in state S in time T. Here, femaleness is denoted by FP, and maleness of a job ad is noted by MP. X's are the job ad specific variables, which I just discussed of education and experience requirements. We have a set of occupation and state fixed effects. We also cluster the standard errors, assuming that there is correlation within an occupation and a state. And we run these regressions separately for the F, N, and M jobs just to see how things change across these 3 different types of jobs. So what do we find? So let's concentrate on the N jobs because maleness and femaleness have been derived from F and end job. So, and the sample here is very small as well. But here, what we're basically finding is that an increase in femaleness, irrespective of whether we control for occupation or we don't control for occupation in columns 3 and 4, tends to decrease the wages which are posted on a particular job ad. Increase in maleness also decreases it, but the decline in wages because of high femaleness is almost double than that is for maleness. So as I said, these are low-skill jobs which anyways would have an excessive preference. So if you explicitly sort of show a very high maleness or femaleness, you do have lower wages, but it's much more negative for femaleness as compared to maleness is what we find, and these coefficients are significantly different from each other. Next, what we want to see is how the application behavior changes when femaleness and maleness changes, and how that interacts with the existence of a gender request. So for instance, here, what is the exercise that I'm doing in my head? So we have the jobs with a female preference, which are red, neutral, which are black, and blue, which are male preference jobs. Now, looking at job ads which have very low femaleness. Now, if such a job ad, so it's a stereotypically low femaleness job, if there is a female request in such a job, do women respond to it? No, they don't. Like there's no statistically significant difference across these 3 lines when there is very low femaleness. It increases sharply as soon as femaleness, increases somewhat. However, if you look at for men, men, even if there is very low maleness associated, but if there is a male request, it would apply to such a job ad. So in a way, this ambiguity aversion, which is typically being spoken about, seems to be holding, in this context somewhat, is what we see in the context of the labor markets, where requests seem to be having some gender differentiated behavior, even across different types of job ads. The next thing we're interested in doing is finding out what is going behind, this black box of maleness and femaleness that I just showed to you. And in order to be able to do that, what we do is that we find that all the prediction that we were getting from the logistic model, which are the words in the job ads which are contributing to this maleness or femaleness. And this is done using an algorithm which is called LINE. So if anyone's interested, they can find more about it. But it's the way it operates is that it randomly removes one or more words from each job ad and then sees how it changes the contribution of that particular job ad towards maleness and femaleness. And then it assigns those scores to the words which are being removed randomly from the set of job ads. However, to be able to do this, we cannot use all the words which come in all the job ads. There are too many of these words. So what we do is that we use the most commonly or frequently occurring words, and we put a limit that we will look at the words which occur at least 10 times in the job ads which have an explicit gender preference. Now, why these job ads? Because these job ads are the ones which are used, which are being used to even predict maleness and femaleness. So these are the words which really matter for us. And what we find is that these 3,000 words actually contain 92% of all word occurrences in the end jobs as well. So we're not missing a lot of words really. However, we then need to manually classify these 3,000 words into a certain set of categories which are meaningful and which make sense given the literature on the labor markets, where it has been shown that skills, personality, job flexibility, maybe some of the attributes which matter to employers, and hence we take these broad categories based on the literature in both the labor market as well as psychology to classify these words into different categories. Then what we do is that for each word, we obtain a relevance score. Now, what is this relevance score? So as I said before, the LIME algorithm basically gives us what is the contribution of each word towards femaleness and maleness. So we construct this relevance score by subtracting the score towards maleness from the score towards femaleness. So if it's a net positive score, then that word is contributing more towards predicting femaleness and as compared to maleness, and hence that word is predictive of a female preference across job ads. Whereas if it's negative, then it's indicative of a preference for a male, if that's where it's contributing more. So what do we find in general? So here I've just listed, just to show you what are these words, and how they really look like. So these are the top 20 words that we found in each skill category, which have contributed to femaleness in the first column and maleness in the second column for each type of word scores. Now, in the hard skills, what we find is that skills which are associated with beauticians like pedicure, manicure, or like accounting skills like tally, ledger skills, or basic computer skills, or skills related to design such as Corel or like survey making like Zoho, etc. Somehow, they are more in the hard skills when it comes hard skills for women, whereas for men, skills related to softwares or hardwares or engineering like WPM, RCM, QC are all engineering. Short terms tend to come in more when looking at the contribution of these skills towards a male preference. On the soft skills, we find that for women, fluency across languages is the predominant theme across these words, whereas for men, while fluency matters, things like negotiation, supervision, liaising, all these also come in, which are not present for women in column 3. We look at words on personality, and for women, we find that again, being presentable, good looking, matters, having confidence, also entrepreneurial comes in, so that's good to see. And for men, you have some words which are related to appearance, but a lot of words are towards being energetic, being able to handle high pressure situations, having, being methodical, being passionate, leaving a good first impression, being resourceful. So different sort of words and adjectives being used when employers are trying to indicate their preference for a particular gender. On the job flexibility side, if words such as being able to work from home or being able to work through Skype calls seem to indicate a preference for women, whereas words which are related to the job requiring travel or working on the weekends or rotational shifts, night shifts, or a job that may require you to relocate to different locations, generally are associated more with male preference in the job market. Then what we do is that we want to be able to construct some meaningful score and look at aggregate categories. Eventually, we can't look at all the 3,000 words. So we've aggregated these words into these 5 categories of skills, soft skills, personality, flexibility, and the other words that we could not classify. To arrive at a net score for every category, we basically sum up the scores of all the words that we have classified under that category. First, we take the sum over femaleness, and we then take the sum over maleness. And then just like we did for every word, we subtracted the two. We subtract the two for every category. If the net score is positive, then it contributes towards femaleness, which is indicated by FW here. Whereas if the net score is negative, we take the absolute value and we plug it into contribution towards the male category gender score. And then we standardize each gender category scores to be able to, to be able to compare them and just to make sense of the coefficients that we get eventually in the regression. So here we undertake similar kind of Minciran regressions that I showed you earlier, and we see what are the effects of these different categories, gender category scores on the wages which are posted on the job portal. Here again, I would like you to concentrate on the N jobs because the sample for the F and the M jobs is very limited. What we find is that if an ad contains words which are indicative of hard skills, which are generally used for women, sees a lower posted wage. For female soft skills and personality, it's actually positive and significant. When the other female categories don't matter. For male categories, almost all categories have a significantly positive effect on the wages posted for a job ad. And here I would like you to keep in mind these negative and positive coefficients for hard skills and flexibility. And why? Because when we look at how the search behavior of candidate is different, is women, so a greater fraction of applicants are women when a job ad contains words which come in the category of female hard skills, and the female applicant share is lower when there are more male flexibility related words which are coming in these job ads. So these two sort of things stand out, where these two job attributes have higher posted wages, Whereas the behavior of candidates reverses, where women tend to apply more if they're female hard skills being listed in a job ad, and they tend to apply less if there are male flexibility related words which are coming across the job ads. So we test the robustness of these regressions that I've shown you. We in the regressions which use candidate application data, we also control, we conduct these regressions and estimate them at the candidate level as well, just that these regressions become huge and incomputable. They take a lot of time to converge, and hence we show them in the appendix. But controlling for the candidate characteristics, things completely hold. We also use the alternative manual classification of occupations that I talked about earlier. We also control for firm specific, fixed effects and see if results go away, but they don't. We also use a different method of construction of gender category scores, where the score associated with a word may be context specific for a particular job ad. One can also tweak with that. And even if we use context specific scores for words which come in a particular job ad. So for instance, a word, when it's coming on its own may have a different contribution towards maleness and femaleness. But if that word is coming with two other words, it may have a different contribution towards maleness and femaleness. And that's what we sort of test the robustness of our estimation results to. And we find that similar patterns are found there as well when we change the way we estimate the scores. As another robustness check, what we do is that we directly, we just undertake a regression where we want to see at the word level which words attract a higher share of female applicants. And here what we do is we first regress the female applicant share and on all the other X's that we have, which are fixed effects and the job characteristics. We get the residuals. Then using these residuals as a dependent variable, we then estimate a ridge regression model. Since this is textual data, we can't estimate the usual regression model. And we obtain a coefficient for every word, which is nothing but the marginal effect of every word on the female applicant share. And what we find is that when we undertake this exercise, there is a very, at least there's a positive and high correlation for words coming in hard skills and flexibility, whereas the correlation is really not there for words coming in the category of soft skills and personality traits, which is, again, related to what we saw, that it's the hard skills and flexibility which seem to be contributing to the patterns that we see in the data and not really soft skills and personality traits. So sort of a second way of validating the previous findings using just a different method of doing the same thing. So let me sort of just chug this out in the interest of time. Coming to, how do we put all these findings together? So I've shown you a different set of results, different patterns in the data, but, how is this contributing to emergence of disparities in the labor market, at least at the application stage? So here the disparity that we look at is the gender wage gap. And we want to see that, how application behavior along different kinds of attributes is contributing to the gender wage gap that we see, which I haven't yet shown you, but which exists on the data portal between men and women. For doing this, we use a semi-parametric decomposition method, which was proposed by Dinardo and co-authors in 1996. So it's nothing but a reweighting method in which we just reweight group A to look like group B. And then we see that if group A looked like group B on certain characteristics, then what would have been the extent of wage gap if these two groups would have had similar observable characteristics. So that is essentially what this technique is trying to do. And using this reweighting method, we first estimate the baseline wage gap, which is essentially the difference between the average wage that a male candidate applies to on this job portal vis-a-vis a female candidate, if the female candidate had the same observable characteristics like education, experience, age as the male applicants on the job portal. So the first thing we do is construct this baseline wage gap using this reweighting method. Once we have the baseline wage gap, we then undertake further reweighting, in which we then decompose what part of this wage gap is being explained by application behavior of candidates along different set of attributes. So I'll show the set of attributes that we look at in our analysis and check the contribution. So the baseline wage gap is 3.5%. So on an average, men apply to job ads which give 3.5, which have a posted wage of 3.5% more than that of female candidates on this job portal. Now, one has to remember that this wage gap looks small here, but on the portal, the employers are actually posting a wage range. It's a minimum and a maximum, and we're taking the midpoint of that range really to get the gender wage gap, and in all the regressions so far that we've seen. Plus, females on this job portal are a very selected sample. So if they're that highly motivated set of females who are looking for jobs, and even then we find this level of wage gap, then it does show that even at the application stage, even amongst the most highly motivated women who are career oriented, one can see these wage gaps arising at the application stage itself. So this baseline wage gap that we have found, we then decompose it into the part that is explained by a certain attribute. In model 1, the attribute that we're interested in are the occupations and locations. So out of this 0.0349, out of this 3.5%, about 1.6% is actually being explained by differential application behavior of men and women to different kinds of occupations on the job portal. And this is about 45% of the raw wage gap. So about 45% of the wage gap can completely be just explained by women and men applying to different occupations on the job portal. An additional 7%. So the next variable, the next attribute we look at is that, on top of the occupations, what if we also control for gender requests? And if we control for gender requests, then the additional gain that we get in the explained proportion is 7%. So again, though it looks small, but one has to remember that this additional is coming from the existence of gender requests on the job portal. And only 7% of the job ads on this portal actually had a gender request. So given that even with 7% of job ads, one is able to explain 7% of the gender wage gap, if there is the phenomenon of gender requests, which is much higher in the government portals in India, if that's the benchmark when one uses, then this can be much higher as the proportion of job ads that exhibit a gender request actually increases on any job portal. The next attribute we're interested in is maleness and femaleness, the implicit measures that we've derived. And here we find that on top of occupation, which explains 45%, about 13% is explained by the implicit measures that we've constructed using the data on the explicit measures themselves. And about 19% is explained by the gendered words that we just discussed, which were extracted from maleness and femaleness that was exhibited by different job ads. So these are approximately 1/3 of the effect of occupations. So if the literature has found that occupational, differences across occupations and working in different occupations explains a large portion of the wage gap, then these attributes, even within occupation, would explain about 1/3 of the wage gap that one sees even within the same occupation across men and women. So to sum up, so this work of ours, basically our aim was to look at more deeply into the question of, how words in job ads may be related to a particular gender, with particular stereotypes, and how they can actually affect wages as well, and the search behavior of men and women differently in the labor market at the application stage itself, and how they may eventually contribute towards the wage gap at the application stage. So what we find is pretty intuitive, that women apply to jobs which are stereotypically female or which have high femaleness. But these jobs also have the lowest advertised wages. And women are willing to pay for attributes such as workplace flexibility. And these are the findings with a set of young people, maybe young, very motivated, skilled people, which are just entering into the labor market. And there is, we have this literature which has shown that early career decisions matter and early career shocks matter. So they can, of course, have cumulative consequences for later life career trajectories for men and women. There's a very recent paper that has actually shown, using data from Chile, if I'm not wrong, is that that when it comes to the final wage gap observed in the main population, about 70% of that wage gap is actually coming from the application stage itself. So they've been able to link the employer-employee data with the application data stage. So given that, I think it just, the research just shows that there are some important, nice features to be looked at the application stage itself, and certain policy measures, especially, I think, prohibiting gender requests may be a good way to at least start with in the developing countries to be able to minimize some of these gaps that we see across gender. So let me just stop there. I think I've taken more time for that.
Thanks, Kanika. I think thanks for a fascinating presentation. To go first.
I think you cut out, Naveen. You may need to re-say the name.
Rashi, do you want to go first?
Oh yeah, sure. Thank you so much, Kanika, for this fascinating presentation. I kind of had like a 3-part question. I'll try to keep it really short, but it's all related to the coding of the implicit bias. So I was curious about like the training data on like, how the hard skills and soft skills were coded. What's like, how did you determine like what was female and what was male? The second question I had was like how you conceptualize like education and skills. Like, do you see it as post-treatment effects of gender? Because obviously education and skills, like low education or low skills, kind of drive wage effects as well. So I was kind of just wondering like just how you think about it. Are you thinking about it as correlated with gender, or are you trying to separate them out and trying to control for them? And the third question was kind of more of a like, how are applicants seeing these words, and are they seeing them the same way as you're coding them? Like, for example, there's some ambiguous ones like school teachers and occupation could be seen as female. It could also be seen as male. But I was wondering if like an IAT or something like that with applicants might be useful, or like, an IAT with like a subset, so that can kind of like help prove your results further.
Thanks, Rafi. I actually did not get the third question. So you were talking about the IIT.
I was just asking about like, how do we like, is there any indication of like how applicants are seeing these words? So like, are applicants seeing these words as gendered? Like just to kind of get like a, like cross verify if like applicants are actually perceiving these words as gendered or not.
Yeah. Okay. So thanks for the great question. Actually, they're very good questions. So first on the, on assigning these words to female and male. So we're not doing any assignment to female and male. The only assignment that we did was classifying them into either hard skills, soft skills, or flexibility, as well as personality appearance. That's the only manual intervention that we did. We then let the algorithm decide, because we have the predictions from the logistic model. So we use the training data set. So the training data set is the set of job ads in which we have the explicit gender request, right? So we basically make use of the existence of gender requests. So if we did not have it, we couldn't have given these gendered scores. So we basically we exploit that bit, that these explicit preferences exist, right? And there are certain kind of texts or words which are being associated or which are being used, right? So we've taken out the male female words, but we've kept the other words. And then we see that which are these other words, which are they, can we even predict it? Maybe we didn't have good predictive power, but actually our model is pretty good. Eventually I didn't show you the model stats, but the correlation was around 0.44, 0.45, which is pretty high for a machine learning model. So that very fact sort of gave us an idea that there seemed to be some consistency. There's certain kind of a pattern or certain kind of jobs in which there seems to be a higher preference for men and women, or either at least an explicit preference for a particular gender. So we essentially, after classification, and it was the logistic classifier scores that we used, along with, so there's this, so in machine learning, after you've made the predictions, you can also go back and check which are the facets of your data which have contributed to those predictions. And that's called explainable AI, essentially. So we use methods in explainable AI to be able to then back out, to be able to then open the black box, basically. Okay, we made these predictions. But what are these words really? Like, we have to understand them, right? What is going behind this femaleness and maleness that we've just coded. And the contribution towards a male or a female request is what makes a particular word either male gender or a female gender. So we're not coding it ourselves. It is what the algorithm is giving to us. So that's the first question. The second question, yes, we are using education and experience more as control variables to be able to control for them, and their effects on posted wages and applicant behavior, because of course the candidate characteristics are also different, and men and women may behave differently to different kinds of job ads in the portal. So they're essentially being used for controls. We've not really looked at their effects in detail. That's not been the main interest in this paper. And third, a very interesting point, how do applicants see it? In fact, that's why we wanted to check the applicant share. If they respond to femaleness, then clearly, they're also seeing some bit of femaleness. Like women are seeing some bit of femaleness in these job ads, and it's not just a figment of our coding it as being female. So that somehow gives us some sort of affirmation, some positive strength and sort of faith in our results that this is just not arbitrarily coding anything. We do see that as femaleness increases, there is an increased share of female applicants. We do see that as maleness increases, there's an increased share of male applicants. So clearly, they're not perfect. It's not that you find zero female applicants if there is very high maleness. No, they reduce, but they don't become zero. So of course, it's not 0-1, but there is definitely some perception change that happens when the wordings change for a particular job ad. So yeah, let me just stop there. I hope about the question.
The last question was interesting one, whether I think you missed that question. How do applicants perceive these advertisements?
No, that's the one she was just responding to. Yeah.
Yeah. So basically, there's no direct way for us to test. I wish we could actually test. We could show these jobs to people. Actually, we could do that. We could actually show these job ads to a set of students. And just ask them, what do you think? Just ask them some belief or perception-based question. I think that's a good idea. One can actually supplement it and actually, using just the same job ads that we've used in our tests and training data, one could actually do it. But we've not done it. So far, we've only relied on what other patterns consistent is what we've done. But this is something which is doable. It's a very small lab experiment which can actually be done, and it will boost sort of. It'll clarify certain things for sure.
Thanks, Kanika. And I have another question adding on to Rashi's questions. How do you see the supply side of this, in a sense that some educational courses seem to have more women in them, like STEM maybe, there's already a kind of a discrimination happening on what course to choose. And how does that show up in these ads? Do you see some sort of a correlation I think there are a few papers, can't recall the name of the paper, where they do show that STEM courses have lesser women compared to men. Similarly for lots of other courses. I also noticed architecture, you mentioned it as a soft, hard female skill. Maybe I do know.
Yeah, so it's jobs which probably, I don't know why, but architecture seems to be more like women kind of architectural skills. Now I'm not sure why.
So how
there could be some randomness here also. I'm not saying that the words are perfectly sort of classified, but
I'm not. I didn't mean that, but I want to know whether you take that into account, in a sense that whether these courses, for some STEM courses, have more men than women. Like lots of courses, like diploma mechanical engineering may have more. So even in the supply side itself is so restricted.
So actually, we actually have the detailed educational qualifications of the candidates. So we control for them. So essentially, we control for them when we run these candidate level regressions, which are either for candidate behavior. So I didn't show them. So all the regressions that I showed were at the job ad level, because they're sort of easier regressions to run. They converge very quickly. But we did sort of control for the candidate specific education. So there we knew that whether a candidate has done, say, BA in STEM or a BA in a non-STEM degree. But what I think is interesting from this aspect of skills is, eventually this supply side of skills. So what is being asked in the market may also be, it's also being sort of, these attributes are also stereotypically formed, right? So the employers specifically requesting for, or more likely to request for a man, if you have an engineering kind of skill which is being required for a particular job, it may also be reflective of the stereotypes that generally prevail in society. And it could just be that there are less women who have these skills. So given that there is a stereotype or a belief amongst the employers and amongst the candidates, where women candidates generally don't have enough STEM, and hence they're not even eligible to apply for a lot of these jobs. So it could just be a reflective of that sort of general equilibrium. But I agree with you, that needs more thought. One needs to look at the skills data for this to be able to exactly tease out, which are the skills which women and men have, and how different are these from the supply side itself. But I don't know if you had that in mind, but that's
exactly,
but that's a very important question, which I think has been thrown up from our findings as sort of a next question to answer. That we see that hard skills make men and women apply differently, but is it because they just perceive these hard skills as different, or is it because they have different, like men and women, because they were enrolled in different kinds of educational institutions, or they took different courses, they have different skills. So there could be these two explanations which are sort of plausible in this case.
One question by Chris. Do you want to go next? So Hari, can you go next? I'll wait for him to unmute.
Sure. Yeah, Kanika, thanks so much for that paper. There's so many interesting findings and a lot of work that's gone into this. So I guess one very small question, which is just my unfamiliarity, maybe just be a mechanical thing about how you guys did this. I was struck in figure 4 with your heat map that sometimes the same word would have opposite coding. So like software, business could be coded both ways. Is that just by based on what else is in the ad? I wasn't quite clear on how that could happen.
Yes,
That's a very small question, but yeah.
No, that's a very important question actually, because the heat map that I showed you, so there the word scores were derived based on the context. So so the software score would come not just from software, but from the two words which are besides the software.
Right.
So we
so then when you give us so then when you're giving us the kind of words that are most commonly associated, it's based on like an overall. It doesn't mean that word is always invoked that way, but okay, got it. Okay,
a median of that, right.
Okay, that was a small mechanical question, but I think the kind of the two larger questions I had in some ways, because there's so many different findings, I think it can be kind of a challenge to kind of back out like what are it doesn't have to be necessarily like a single coherent big picture, but one thought I had was that there are like a series of connected findings in the paper that suggest that maybe some of the action is elsewhere. So for example, I was struck by the fact that both male and female in table 1, right, that you have, and you touched on this for just a second, but the idea that if there's an explicit femaleness or maleness in the N jobs column in table 1, you have a negative, it's a negative effect on advertised wages. And to me, that begs the question of like, and you said, okay, overall, this is kind of relatively lower wage jobs, but it's also, to me, that wasn't a fully compelling explanation of that, what does it mean that any gendered indication is identifying a subset of jobs that have lower wages, including for men? So I mean, that may have to do with, I would be interested in just unpacking that the gender doesn't always just mean the gender gap between men and women, but here there's also a gendered aspect to just both any gender being indicated in a job ad. And I think at least the way that you dealt with it in the presentation, I'd like to hear more about that, because I think it suggests that there's also a larger story happening within which the story that you're telling is happening, but it's also an I think about that finding in conjunction with the finding that female personality, actually relates to higher wages. What I mean is, if you look at, there's so many findings in the paper that I can potentially come up with a different narrative. I understand the aggregate findings on application rates, where you're like, this is actually a kind of mixed and very diverse picture of the employment portal. And what we're actually throwing up is that there's kind of this complex, very complex landscape in which a gender gap exists. But really what we're showing is that it's also a very complex hiring landscape. And that relates to the second thought I had, which was on employer intent. And I know that that's not what you're dealing with here, and that's a different data challenge. But theoretically, is this a model in which employers are aware and using this strategically to kind of signal their ideas, or is it kind of either implicit or stereo? But even with an implicit, there's a sense that there's an implicit goal in mind, or is it that they're actually completely unaware that they're kind of producing these different applicant streams? And I'm not sure that you need to deal with this in this paper, but if we're really thinking about how this paper opens up new research on the kind of labor market in India, to me, a lot of it is in this kind of the most kind of interesting and arresting findings are that it's actually kind of a complicated landscape. And I'm not even sure I could understand as an employer what my intent would be in that landscape with particular job ads. So sorry, it's a long-winded question, but that's my thought.
No, thanks a lot. I think I'll take your second question first, because we thought a lot about it. We actually thought a lot, and the writing underwent a lot of change actually because of the changing thoughts as we were trying to process the results. And I think again, it would be wrong to say that it is the employer's intent always. If you're expressing an explicit request, of course that's your intent. But if I'm not putting an explicit request, I just want someone who can work on weekends. Or if I just want someone, it's a traveling job, it's a marketing job. I want you to travel from from one part of the city to the other part of the city. Do I really want a man or a woman? It may just be a job attribute that I want from my employee. Now that job attribute has low flexibility and hence women will not apply to it. But is that my intent? That I don't want a woman? I'm not very sure. I don't think we can say that from this analysis so far. It's still ambiguous. I wouldn't sort of hang my hat on either that employers have an intent or they actually don't have an intent, because in some cases they may even have an intent where at least some employers may, okay, we don't want women for this job, so let's put these outright, upfront. These are the qualities that we want, and we know that they won't apply for these jobs then. So, but that's something which I agree is again up for future work in the sense that how employers perceive. So if you show them these job ads, how employers perceive them to be, do they think that a particular job ad is wanting a female, or they just think that these are just certain job attributes that that particular job has? So again, it's a future question up for future research just to see how employers perceive this. Second, on the question of the negative effect on wages of both femaleness and maleness. Now, again here, so the base category here, so these scores have been constructed with the base category of no preference, right? So this is a multinomial model where you have male, female, and then you have the third category of neutralness. And so one thing we understood is that in general, these typical sort of gendered words. Now, again, this is also a problem of data. I will tell you why, because our training data itself is using explicit job ads, like these explicit gendered preference job ads. And now the training data itself is finding that these job ads on average have lower skills. Okay, that is what will get reflected in your eventual, even if you predict it for the other jobs. So here, I also think that it's an artifact of the way we've constructed it using explicit measures. And hence it's the gender category scores, which I find sort of more where we know what's going on. When we look at just the overall maleness, femaleness, it's not really sure that what is it that is going into this maleness and femaleness, which are being predicted and which are being taken from the explicit gender request. But when we look at the gender categories for the gendered words, essentially we know what we're looking at because we can make sense of it. So that's why the first part, I think, is just an artifact of the model itself, where the model has been trained and predicted using the data on these gender requests themselves. So if I would have used another way of arriving at maleness,
Mhm.
femaleness, maybe I wouldn't have gotten it.
No, that might be important to like, I mean, and maybe it's there in the paper and I missed it, but that might be important to acknowledge, especially, just saying that this is kind of the limitation. And also, would that then lead to limitations in other parts of the analysis? Like if we take that implication forward, is there a reason to think it's just contained to that particular result, or that it might, it might also, because that's the kind of thing that you're taking. I understand what you're saying. This is the advantage of having multiple different cuts like you guys do in the paper, but I think making that a little explicit and kind of saying that it's kind of a contained problem would be helpful, or understanding where it would be contained to. Yeah,
I think it needs to be acknowledged, and the fact that your eventual predictions are an artifact of your training, right? So I think that has to be acknowledged, and that is what because there was a way of doing it at least, and we use this way of doing it.
Sure.
But of course, it's not a foolproof, and it's not the only way that one could use. One could use other ingenuous ways, if one can get preferences.
Thanks so much.
To go next, and this will be the last question.
Thank you so much. I recognize we're at time already. I'll be quick. Thank you so much. It's been fascinating. The question that I have, I recognize is informed by a fair amount of ignorance, so I apologize in advance. You've already spoken a little bit on how this data might inform policy changes. I'm curious to know your perspective on how any initiatives for better wage equity in India might be politicized by the Indian government. I know how it tends to play out in the United States, but I'm not sure how it compares and contrasts to the Indian context.
So you mean initiatives regarding what? Initiatives regarding equal pay?
Taking exactly, like the findings from this project and putting it towards sort of informing policy changes to reach a better gender wage equity.
So I think what policy implication that I could see is that if you get rid of gender requests, and like you have to look at the Indian government job portals. You really have to look at them. Just check Delhi government job portal. Just look at the national, the NCS job portal. That's the National Career Services in India. You'll find that they actually have an explicit gender request, and you can just take a sample of these job ads, and because and you'll find a lot of these job ads want men. So we actually even looked at one of these job portals, and interestingly, almost 40% of the demand was for men on these job portals. So which is much higher than say what employers are wanting on the private sector job portal, because they're much more sort of aware that they should not be doing something on a private job portal. The kind of employers which are posting here, but on government job portals, clearly people use this since it is available. I'm going to use this to give out my gender preference for a particular gender, and I think that is a clear policy implication. You clearly see that having a gender request is leading to gender wage inequity in the labor markets. It's also sort of reinforcing some of the beliefs that may be existing, which are stereotypical, and you can just keep percolating them or keep perpetuating them if you continue to have such explicit sort of preferences being allowed to be posted on job portals or on any, for that matter, any advertising platform. So I think that is one clear policy implication which I take from the results of this paper, is that these need to go away. I mean, that is clearly one policy implication. Now, there are of course many other things that like, can the governments really do anything about it? I'm not very sure. We already have a lot of legislation, but we know that it goes nowhere. So we already have these so many acts on which there should be equity on various dimensions, but we know that enforcement is an issue. So at least what can be enforced is the simple rule of not allowing any sort of explicit preference for a particular gender, at least when an ad is being posted. Of course, that doesn't guarantee anything, but I think eventually things do improve when stereotypes get shedded in the long run. But we have to give them a chance to sort of shed. You can just stop there. Yeah.
Thanks, Kanika. I think with that parting comment, I think it's good to seminar. Thanks everyone for attending the seminar. Next week we have Spagato Ganguly, who will be talking on foreign policy, India's foreign policy. Thanks a lot. Have a nice day ahead.